Today, I have a tremendous pleasure and honor. I actually met Dr. McCullough at a conference in Canada. It was meeting him face to face. It's quite incredible meeting someone for the first time. And he represents one of those voices that has been so important with regards to adding balance to what is happening in the pandemic. He has been through the storm. They have attacked him from all sides. He has remained consistent and battled on through the pandemic and remains a savior almost, an advocate for investigation and science around this COVID pandemic. So it's tremendously wonderful to have him here with me, and I'll add him in here. So, Peter, how are you today? Are you doing okay?
Doing great. Great to be on with you and terrific to see you recently. Oh, no.
Yes, you just broke up just a little bit there, so I hope your internet connection stays all right. Now, listen, Peter, I just want you to just very quickly summarize your background before we get into our chat.
I'm in practice as an internal medicine and cardiovascular physician in Dallas, Texas. And yeah, I'm entering my fourth decade of clinical practice. I have been in academic medicine from the very start, worked my ranks up from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor of medicine. And to do so, I moved between institutions. I was the chief of cardiology for a period of time at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. I was the chief academic and scientific officer of the largest health ministry in Ascension Health for a period of time. That's probably the biggest job I had. I was equivalent of a dean at a medical school. And so I held these various positions, moved around the United States to some degree as I ascended. My major focus, though, was the interface between heart and kidney disease. And I had observed that patients, as they have declining renal function, had increasing rates of all kinds of cardiovascular events. And I hypothesized that, in fact, there were unique factors circulating between the heart and the kidneys that were driving this. And then, over the decades, worked through the basic epidemiology, the in vitro diagnostics, and we ultimately got to therapeutic targets. And so the entire cardiorenal hypothesis was fulfilled. And I became the editor of the textbook Cardiorenal Medicine, the editor in chief of the journal Cardiorenal Medicine. I wrote the chapter in the Braunwald's textbook of cardiology, which is the Bible of cardiology, on this topic. So I was well known to the academic community. Had lectured all over the United States, Canada, UK, Europe, all over. I testified in Congress at the U.S. Congressional Oversight Panel for the FDA on a product label expansion in 2007. So I was on what's called C-SPAN, which is a government TV station. So I was well known to the academic community before the pandemic.
Wow. And so this is important. And this is why I think your voice represents one of those things that is extremely difficult for the scientific community who may not like what you're saying because they know where you're coming from. But let's now take all of that background, all of that medicine, all of that professor stuff. How in the world, as a cardiologist, did you even get involved with COVID? Most cardiologists don't even like general medicine, quite frankly. They're focusing on the heart, interventional cardiology, and so on. How did you even get involved in COVID?
Well, I maintain my board certification in internal medicine. I'm certified through 2 boards in the United States, and I've always maintained that over time. I always prided myself on being a very strong general medicine physician, as well as maintain my boards in cardiology. Only about 4% of cardiologists, as you implied, keep that degree of certification. Because I had large health system roles, I needed to have that credibility in general internal medicine, not just be a sub specialist. And then on top of that, because I did multidisciplinary research between heart and kidney disease, it was very important. Now, it turns out that cardiologists are playing a big role in the pandemic response because of the issues of cardiovascular events and thrombosis.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And that's that. But at the beginning, what you would have had, and let me deal with a question here that I see all the time. People keep on saying, well, you're not a virologist, you're not an infectious diseases specialist, you're not a respiratory physician. And I'm saying the thing about COVID is that it crosses all specialties.
Mhm.
It's actually very general, which is what causes some of the problems. But we still have to try and understand when the pandemic started, what were you doing in and among that kind of decision making around COVID?
Well, as we heard the events out of China and then Milan specifically, our health system gathered into workforces, task forces, and I led one of the task force. We were on frequent calls about how we were going to deal with personal protective equipment, masks and gowns, how to organize the hospital, creation of special COVID units, reverse ventilation. And what I observed over the first few weeks is that in this preparatory phase, virtually all the preparation was to actually intended to protect the doctors and the healthcare workers. And I started to think, wait a minute, there's nothing here for the patient. There wasn't any preparation for how the patient was going to be treated. And I remember bringing this up on a couple of calls. I said, okay, we've got ourselves covered. Well, what about the poor patients when they get sick? Are we going to have anything to offer them to help them avoid hospitalization and death? And the conference call just went silent, as if no one wanted to think about the sick patient.
So this is then what led you into looking at solutions. And because I'm trying to understand, because this is what people don't quite get, is that they don't quite get why is it that you were doing this and nobody else was? What made you decide, what, let me try and see what I can find. Let me use my research tools and
Right.
understanding to try and find a solution. Because as you said, nobody else was doing it. What made you confident that you could find something?
I've always considered myself a very confident clinician. And for most viral illnesses, we've learned, for instance, influenza, everyone became a quick study on the influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic. And, one reviewing that would quickly understand that they didn't die of influenza. They died of secondary staphylococcal infection by and large. And that, viral upper respiratory tract infections, even severe ones, the name of the game is to provide supportive care, treat secondary infections, and then if we can actually identify something about the illness where there's more treatment targets to do everything we can to orient the available products towards those. So I took it on as this is like the ultimate academic challenge. I waited for a few weeks and I thought somebody at Harvard or Oxford or Charity in Germany or Karolinska or Duke University, somebody would come out and say, okay, we've got this. Here's a basic approach that we should do on high-risk patients to help prevent hospitalization and death. And no one came up with anything. And we got several weeks into it, and I was communicating with colleagues in Detroit, and I was communicating actually very intensively with Dr. Harvey Risch at Yale, an epidemiologist. I said, Harvey, there's no protocols emerging. We knew about Vladimir Zelenko, a family physician in Monroe, New York, kind of a rural area in New York State. But I said, listen, there's just no academic medical centers doing this. And largely Harvey and myself, and then there were some middle authors. John McKinnon played a big role from Detroit. We came up with what's called the McCullough Protocol now. It was the first publication of, in a stepwise fashion, what could be done to treat the illness at home and help avoid hospitalization and death. I mean, it was a great opportunity. I wish I was competing with Harvard or Duke or UCLA. There should have been a whole bunch of competing protocols at these centers.
I agree. So here's the thing now, because as you pull back from it, I know what you mean in that it seemed as though everybody was happy to just wait for someone else to do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So explain why, because it's not very often you reach a pandemic, but what it has done is that it has unveiled to the public the fact that doctors seem to be more comfortable inside a box and not
Mhm.
actually coming up with innovative, creative solutions. What do you think caused that lack of response? Any thoughts now as you look back at that time? Anything?
I think initially it was personal fear. We had heard reports out of Milan that doctors were dying of the illness, some older Italian doctors, and indeed they did. And I think it was personal fear. I think doctors said, listen, if we have to come in contact with this, if we're going to try to treat this as an outpatient, we're going to be brought into contact with this and our lives could be put at risk. So doctors withdrew quickly. Clinics were shut down, surgery centers, cardiac catheterization laboratories. And then it was largely just left to the urgent care centers and the ER to receive this load of patients. And if each center, would have put up an ambulatory approach, they could have put a tent up, then they could have been forward facing. But I think it was a combination of fear. In the United States, we quickly had an executive order from Trump that allowed telemedicine to happen. So doctors did their routine practice in telemedicine. And I think most doctors quickly said, you know what, they're not going to be in the COVID business. They're not going to be, this is a business where people get sick, they could die. They don't want the legal risk of it. They would just tell patients, listen, go to the hospital.
I'm going to ask you a question here now that I think is very important, because one of the things that's happening out of the pandemic is that it is unveiling the dark side, or the ugly side of medicine. And one of the ugly sides of medicine is what I call defensive medicine.
Mhm.
And what patients don't understand is that defensive medicine is about protecting doctors and systems, not protecting patients. They think it's so that patients can be safe. So that sounds to me like doctors went in the defensive mode.
Mhm.
We are protecting ourselves, and almost, well, tough luck for the patients. When did this become standard in medicine?
I don't think it previously had occurred, but remember, almost all medicine besides this pandemic is on the non-global emergency basis. Remember, medicine moves very incrementally, diabetes treatment, kidney disease, even trauma care has some standardization to it. There's been enough trauma over enough years where we have advanced trauma life support systems. We have algorithms for almost anything. So when something comes out of the box like this, for which there is no fundamental approach, none, then, and the issue at hand is preventing hospitalization and death. What we learned is our academic medical centers, despite all the time, all the resources, all the firepower, they are absolutely without any ability to come up with emergency solutions. We should never look to the orthodoxy again to be the first to bring a solution. And throughout history, that's been the case. When there's been a crisis occurred, 1,000 years ago, the orthodoxy back then actually was the church. The answer never came from the church. The answer always comes from people thinking out of the box, people who are willing to take intellectual risks. And at times, I think take personal risks. With COVID, I think it was much more the ability to take an intellectual risk.
And when we think, therefore, about it, and you worked with other clinicians and you come up with the McCullough protocol and you start to look at ways to treat patients, did you for any moment ever imagine that the system would be unhappy with you finding solutions?
No, I thought just the opposite. I thought the system would be welcome to see this. In fact, I worked so hard on the algorithm, and it was different than what other groups had done. Simultaneously, it was a little bit later, but the FLCC group came up with a list. Zelenko came up with a list. He said, no, I came up with a protocol, step one, step two. And we started out actually with with methods to try to reduce the amount of inoculum and reinoculation. And when we came up with this, and I'm in the game of publication. I had previously published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm very, very broadly published hundreds of papers that were listed in the National Library of Medicine. I was going to submit this to New England Journal of Medicine, but I saw that New England had published a paper from a fraudulent database about ACE inhibitors and acute COVID-19, and Lancet from the same fraudulent database published on hydroxychloroquine and COVID. And I said, something's wrong. And so I did not submit the paper to New England Journal of Medicine. We had the paper together, the original McCullough protocol paper together by July 1 of 2020. So I contacted Joe Alpert at the American Journal of Medicine, and COVID was just beginning to sweep into Phoenix, Arizona. He's in Phoenix. He's actually down at Tucson. I said, Joe, I have the very first protocol to treat COVID, and I'm going to publish it. It's a proposal. It's not like I've done a clinical trial. This is just a proposal, but it's a basis upon which trials can be done. He said, well, I'll give it a fair review. And we actually had it fully published in American Journal of Medicine by August 7th of 2020. And then immediately it was the most widely downloaded paper from that journal. It just went like fire. And I knew it would, because it was the first proposal of how to handle the problem.
So when did you start to get the pushback?
The pushback happened with letters to the editor. And letter to the editor started coming in. It turns out there was a total of 6 of them to the American Journal of Medicine. Now, I've been the former editor of 2 major journals. I'm the editor of a major journal right now. So I'm in this business. Usually 2 letters to the editor is enough. I mean, there may be more people who want to banter this around, but there were 6 letters to the editor. They came in from Monash University in Australia, Duke University, McGill in Canada, came from Brazil. And the theme of the letter was, Dr. McCullough, you can't treat acute COVID patients. You can't do this. You don't have enough evidence. It may cause harm. We have to wait. You can't do this. And, and every time I responded, there were more and more data supporting the various elements in the protocol. And I got to the point where, a letter to the editor is a very high risk thing, because the response is usually one that many times the person who wrote the letter to the editor is not wanting to see. And I think one of them, I almost said this, overcome your fear and join me in treating sick patients with acute COVID-19.
And what do you think was the cause of this immediate pushback? Because
again, I think it was fear driven.
it can't be fear driven, because I had just said something recently, just today actually, and I went back to it when the Oxford recovery trial developed dexamethasone and they saw that it helped. The obvious question was, okay, why not use prednisolone or hydrocortisone? And did we get the dosing right? And the immediacy of starting that arm of the trial should have been straight away. They didn't start it until December 2021. And so for me, I look at these things and I say they had to get pushback to cause them to do that, because that's not natural for them to suddenly stop investigating dexamethasone. So in the same way, is it possible, based now on what we have seen through the pandemic, that anything that could be seen as a treatment strategy needed to be suppressed?
Well, remember, by that time, so this is August 7th, 2020, by that time, there was broad messaging that we should wait and be saved by a vaccine. That was already out there. I had published something else very important in August of 2020. I published an op-ed in The Hill, which is widely read by the House, the Senate, and the White House, people in Washington. And by invitation in 2020, Scott Atlas from Harvard, and then myself from Dallas, we were invited to write op-eds. I mean, I was a prominent physician in the United States, widely respected, Scott the same. So he was writing about masks and lockdowns, and I was writing about the spread of the virus, what we were seeing, and the need for treatment. But in August of 2020, I think it was August 20th, 2020, I published an op-ed, and it was titled "The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine Development Program." And boy, am I glad I did that. Now that's 4 months before the first COVID-19 vaccines are released. Do you know no other prominent figure in medicine wrote such a paper that they can actually point to? Not even Robert F. Kennedy. Not even Robert F. Kennedy. I was able to find a podcast where Robert F. Kennedy and Sherry Tenpenny and a few other people on were generally talking about vaccine safety and said, yeah, the COVID-19 vaccines are likely to be unsafe. But no one put it in writing. No one actually called the White House and said, listen, we're concerned about this. So you're looking at the only figure that I can find. If you can find somebody, let me know.
yeah. No, so this is important because it just showed how powerful that groupthink was.
Yeah.
That they, and to be frank with you, the minute I saw that the highest risk factor for severe disease was hypertension, I thought to myself, something is very wrong here. This is not behaving like a normal viral infection. And so, therefore, you need to be very careful if you're going to be throwing a vaccine in the midst of a disease that causes a cytokine storm, which is an immune mediated
Right.
response. And
Right.
so, when you now look at these things, it almost seems as though everybody was so sure and so desperate to get a vaccine that worked that they just stopped being objective,
Yeah.
looking at what was happening.
Yeah, you're right. They were sold this, the sales proposition on this. Everyone bought into this to prepare for the vaccine. I'll never forget in October of 2020. This is before the clinical trials were done on the vaccines. Our major pharmacies, which are CVS and Walgreens, were advertising on Dallas radio that they were proud to offer COVID-19 vaccines when they become available. Now, we have never had pharmacies advertise a product before it was approved. How did they even know it was actually going to work or be approved? So the preparation was there. They were already being pre-advertised before the clinical trials were done. The clinical trials results were announced by press briefing that they were over 90% effective without having us being able to examine the data. And then, I testified in the U.S. Senate November 19th, 2020, focusing on early treatment. And again, the minority witness, Ashish Jha, who later became the White House coronavirus coordinator, he kept saying, Dr. McCullough, you don't have enough evidence for treatment. You don't have the evidence that we're going to have with the vaccines. And he said, America deserves large clinical trials like we have with the vaccines. So it was clear that there was going to be a suppression of treatment. Treatment was never going to have enough evidence. It's never going to have government support. The only thing that's really going to have support is vaccination.
This is pretty significant. This is why when you reflect now, and I think this is why it's so important to capture these thoughts and to capture this storyline, because not many people even remember what had happened at that time and how things evolved. So all of this is happening. You're pushing this McCullough protocol and early treatment. You're getting more attention about it. When did this start to come home to roost for you with regards to work?
I had an experience where quickly, we almost had ivermectin in the first protocol. John McKinnon up in Detroit was having some experience in Central America. He said, listen, ivermectin is really working. And I said, gosh, outside of scabies, we've never really used it. And we started looking, we almost put ivermectin in the first protocol. We had no idea about dose and duration. And so we held off, but literally within a month or so of the original publication of American Journal of Medicine, we said, listen, we have to update it. We have to. We're getting more and more positive data on ivermectin. We had learned that I think Russia and India had favipiravir. The steroids became the RECOVER trial. We saw the RECOVER trial, by the way. I'm glad you mentioned it. As I recall, the mortality, even in the steroid group, was about 20%. And again, it was my clinical judgment. I said, listen, dexamethasone 6 milligrams a day, we just don't use doses like that. For our applications in the ICU, it's like 10 milligrams every 4 hours or every 6 hours. 6 milligrams a day is just an odd dose of what's a glucocorticoid. We typically don't use glucocorticoids for respiratory infections. So I said, listen, I've got to get prednisone in there. We had positive data, more and more positive data coming out on colchicine. So the protocol had to be updated literally within a few months. So I put together the updated version, and I needed to publish quickly. So I chose the Proceedings of the Baylor University Medical Center, which is a PubMed journal, but it's edited at our medical center. I talked to the editor. I said, listen, I've got an update. I worked with got peer reviewed, answered the peer reviewers. And then I even worked with the executive editor, deputy editor on the amount of overlap from the first paper. So we had all that negotiated. It was fully accepted. I paid the copyright and the contract fees to Taylor and Francis Color Figures. And so this was a done deal. It was going to be published in Taylor and Francis. In fact, it was. And then I got a call about a month later. I kept asking Taylor and Francis, I said, I'm going to be testifying in the Senate. I need to cite that paper in my testimony. And they kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We're now like about 2 months. And then I go down to the editor's office. He goes, I've never seen this before, but this has actually been taken out of PubMed. The PubMed, the National Library of Medicine, says there's too much overlap with your first paper. And it was just, this editor who's now deceased, William Roberts, is the most experienced editor in the world. He says he's never seen it at this level, that when things get fully published. So, I got a sick feeling in my stomach. I said, some powerful forces somewhere are working to really suppress any advancement of the McCullough protocol.
And so at this point now, you must be thinking, goodness gracious, what is going on? What made you continue?
Well, yeah, I said it's too important. The protocol is too important. We started having calls. It was working. People were using it. So I submitted it to Reviews in Cardiovascular Medicine, of which I was fully the editor of the journal at the time. We assigned a guest editor for this, and it went out for peer review. And here was something interesting. Now, I was the editor of that journal. It always has an associate editor assigned and then 2 reviewers. Of interest, that paper got 6 reviewers assigned to it. 6. Since when? Who made that decision? I couldn't believe it. So I got 6 sets of comments. So I had this very lengthy rebuttal letter. We added it. I think the paper itself had, I think well over 100 references for a 30-page manuscript. It was unbelievable. And it was finally published in Reviews in Cardiovascular Medicine in December of 2020. So it took a Herculean effort to get 2 versions of it. It wasn't called the McCullough protocol at that time. It was simply called sequence multi-drug treatment. Later on, one of the big treatment groups in the United States copyrighted it under my name because they said, listen, we have to anchor it to somebody so we know what we're talking about. And then over time, I just, ultimately fully was awarded the copyright on it. And I thought to myself, you know what? I've taken a huge intellectual risk. I might as well just put my name on it and be responsible. If it doesn't work, I'm going to hear this the rest of my career. But if it works and people find that the methods work, then, it certainly would be a great contribution.
So now, I can sense now, because as I said, I can see with hindsight, and I can see that the main push was for the fact that the scientific community believed, the politicians believed, the investors believed all these vaccines were going to not just save lives, but literally stop the pandemic. The
Right.
train was running full force, and anything that could have damaged that emergency use authorization would have been a problem. So you then become a target. When did you start to get targeted at work?
I slightly disagree with that. I don't think it was emergency use authorization, because we later learned that emergency use authorization is loosely used even if there's no emergencies. The most recent boosters have emergency use authorization, and there's even no clinical data. They just have animal data. And in fact, bamlanivimab, which was a monoclonal antibody, had EUA approval before the vaccines, and that was an outpatient therapy. By the way, bamlanivimab was added to McCullough protocol for that second revision. So it wasn't the EUA. That wasn't the issue. I think the issue is if people thought there was an approach to treat acute COVID-19 early and avoid hospitalization and death, that they would potentially not take a vaccine, and that powerful entities thought early treatment would actually lead to vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy is the target that they wanted to essentially destroy. And so it was the linkage between early treatment and vaccine hesitancy potentially that needed to be destroyed.
And so, as I said, then when did it come to touch you personally with regards to your work?
Well, I had I got a few attacks late 2020. It was largely after my U.S. Senate testimony, November 19th, 2020. But it was shortly after that there was a doctor group in Houston that attacked me in the Houston newspaper and said that I was pushing hydroxychloroquine. And I wasn't pushing anything. The protocol actually allowed a variety of choices. I mean, that's the best thing about a protocol. It's step 1, step 2, step 3. It doesn't push any particular drug. And so then I responded to that group in a letter to the editor in the newspaper. Then immediately my employer picked that up and said, you've made an ad hominem attack. So I started to get some difficult letters from my employer. And while the initial feedback from the U.S. Senate hearing was very favorable, actually, I got an email from the hospital president and everything was great. By January of 2021, I was called into a conference room and I was told that my contract, which had been renewed every year, it's called an evergreen renewal, was not going to be renewed.
So, yeah, now this is where people don't understand the personal side of stuff and sacrifice. At this point, they are taking away your contract. You know, you must at this point start to wonder, is this worth it? Why bother? Why is it time to back off? Did that come into your mind at all?
Well, it never was an option. So it's not like I was called into a room and said, listen, this has gone too far. If you, be quiet on COVID, I think, we can get things rectified and you can stay here. There was a decision made before I was ever called into a room that I was going to essentially be, pushed out of my position. There was no board vote. There was no president sign off. None of the stipulations of my contract were followed. In fact, I brought that up and the administrators said, listen, we're not following your contract. And they seemed set under it. So I didn't really have a choice. Now, my colleagues in Detroit at Henry Ford, who were on the original paper, it was very public where they were given a gag order. They were told by their hospital, do not say a word about COVID. And that included Mark Zervos, William O'Neill, John McKinnon. And so they followed the gag order. Myself and my department chief, Kevin Whelan, in the summer of 2020, we had a soft gag order from the health system chief medical officer, but it wasn't articulated in any way. I wasn't told to sign anything. So, so for me, I was quickly out. Fortunately, I had an excellent clinical reputation. I had a research team, it was well funded. So I simply changed employers within the same university environment. I just literally moved my office from one place to another. I think I was out of clinical practice for a total of 51 days during that transition because I had to re-credential through a new medical group. And then I was up and running again, seeing patients. And but the heat didn't stop when I changed employers.
Yeah, this is what and I think people don't understand this, and this is where I think that when I read, I listen to the what I do social listening when people are commenting, and I look at what they're commenting on, and I can see that there is a lot of public upset about doctors not saying more and doing more and so on. But I don't know if people realize just how much of a sacrifice it is, because not only did they try and take away your job, they tried to take away your license to practice. This was I mean, they were going for the jugular here with regards to it.
Well,
Most people would
the
have backed
second
down.
position lasted for about 2 years. And I increasingly was in the media. I had been on Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, was constantly, I was on national TV primetime in the United States, basically hundreds of times. So, the second position, again, I'm called into a room after 2 years, very successful practice, and was let go. Now, it was very amicable. I was given all the patient records. I was able to transfer to yet another office, in a private office in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. But now I was physically out of the medical center and out of job number 2. Meanwhile, employer number 1 had filed a lawsuit against me, saying that I had violated terms of the separation, that I was dragging their name into the media. The hospital kept me on their website. I was on medical staff, so there was already in being intertwined. But the hospital that sued me, the major medical center, they originally went to the newspapers first with a press release. Then the newspapers contacted me. So I was already tarred and feathered. That seemed to be the goal of this, was professional injury. And believe it or not, one of the big email news services to doctors had listed me among the top 20 worst doctors in America. So how could I go from, I was the named endowed lecturing professor at Harvard in 2 divisions in 2019, the most published person in my field in the world. How did I go from that in 2019 to one of the worst doctors in America in 2021? And if you look at my Wikipedia page, it was sparkling with all my accomplishments. And somehow in the summer of 2021, just like when that lawsuit hit, suddenly overnight, my Wikipedia page changed and I was a conspiracy theorist spreading misinformation.
Listen, as I said, you clearly have a personality that is able to take massive blows. Because no, I'm serious. Because thinking about it, to lose 2 jobs, to be publicly vilified after all of your work and all of the years and the dedication to develop your craft and position yourself, and to have it stripped away from you simply because you were trying to protect and advocate for patients. Now, what must that tell all the other doctors who are looking on and saying, hell no, I don't care what it is, I am just towing the line?
Well, one time I was on Fox News, and I think Laura Ingraham said that. She said, if this establishment can do this to you, Dr. McCullough, can you imagine what the other doctors are thinking? What about a junior assistant professor of medicine, associate professor of medicine, who's just getting their career launched? They look at this and they see what happens to me. There's no way they're going to step out of line. So in many ways, I probably, you imagine, I was made an example of. So the lawsuit didn't have any merit, but it ground on for 1.5 years. It tarnished my reputation. It was finally just dismissed out of court, and I prevailed. As you mentioned, much later, my license came under review. I've prevailed there. I met the standard of care, but yet the medical board offers a settlement. but for no wrongdoing. I think the worst has been the American Board of Internal Medicine, who crafted a COVID misinformation policy in September of 2021. They went back in time to my Texas Senate testimony in March of 2021 and said I violated their policy that didn't exist at the time. So how can I possibly follow guardrails of a policy that doesn't exist? And at that point in time, I realized that, listen, nothing matters now. There are no fair rules. There is no fairness. There is simply a new normal that this biopharmaceutical complex that I indicate in my book has formed. It's a syndicate, and anybody who goes against the narrative is going to be targeted. And it doesn't matter what techniques are used. It doesn't matter if it's before or after a policy. It doesn't matter that there's going to be no fairness in review boards or courts or anywhere else.
So here's the question, because I have now had the privilege of speaking to a number of physicians. I spoke with Dr. Shelton in New Zealand. I know I've been speaking with Dr. Shetty. I've spoken with Dr. Victor in Malaysia. The pattern is the same, and doctors need to toe the line. But what I'm really concerned about is that the attacks are coming from doctors. Why would doctors be upset with you for trying outside the box when there is no other option? I can't understand that. I genuinely am struggling. It's almost as if you stepping out of line is not allowed. What is going on?
I think that's the new normal. American Board of Internal Medicine uses evidence-based and consensus-driven. They essentially say that the government guidelines, NIH, CDC, FDA, this guidance, and that we would be MHRA probably in the UK or TGA in Australia. That's it. And if you deviate from that, you're done. You're done. And that's never been the case. I mean, in cardiology, for instance, a new guidelines would come out on lipid management, let's say 5 years ago. And the first thing we do is we debate it. No, the guidelines are wrong. They're obsolete. You know, we never take a guideline as a law and treat it like a law. And if we violate this law, that we penalize one another. But yet this has happened. The other thing that's crept into medicine is propaganda.
Expand.
Propaganda is when one person wants to force their view on another person. It's very important. Propaganda is heavily used in World War II by the Third Reich. And it has a set of tools. In fact, there was an office of propaganda in World War II Germany. And it uses specific terms to, in a sense, grab a moral superiority in an argument or a tautology, and then use that to drive and force one's narrative on another. So there are 6 terms. One is misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, anti-science, anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theorist. They're known propaganda tools. So if one accuses me of spreading misinformation, then immediately they actually hold the truth. They hold information, and I don't. Do you see what I mean? It's one or the other. And so this is a way of immediately injuring someone else. They're spreading misinformation. They're anti-science. These terms are used to denigrate someone else and at the same time achieve moral superiority. So there's someone in Houston who does it as part of his standard lecture tour, Peter Hotez. And he writes a book called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science. Essentially, what he's saying is that he is science, he represents science, and anybody who opposes him, let's say brings up an issue on vaccine safety, that they're anti-science. So this is classic propaganda. It didn't exist in the medical literature until 2021. Now, if you look, misinformation is a mesh heading in PubMed. We have the Oxford Misinformation Index, which is a scoring index. There are offices of misinformation, conferences on misinformation. The US FDA commissioner, the WHO executive director, Tedros Ghebreyesus, and Bill Gates, and many others have said the single greatest threat to global health is not heart disease or cancer or diabetes, it's misinformation. So again, it's a way of, as soon as one uses the word misinformation, they have the upper hand in whatever argument's being made.
You know, in truth, Pete, as I'm listening to you here, I felt a little bit sick as I listened to what you were saying. And I felt sick because I realized that fundamentally, the job that we have as medics and clinicians to heal, to find ways of healing, can't happen because we technically have become advanced pharmacists, and our job is to follow the instructions that have been given to us for the purpose of financial gain, not necessarily patient benefit. And this is very serious because there are many conditions. What I'm realizing now as the veil has been pulled back, and I am now looking hard at evidence as to, well, did this actually work? Did that actually work? Where did that come from? We are starting to see that much of what we thought was science was actually just captured propaganda. This is really, really difficult. And I suspect this is one of the reasons why clinicians will push back, because they don't want the status quo to change and they would prefer it to remain the way it was. The problem is, COVID has changed everything. From
You know,
this point on, I keep on telling people is that if the only way forward here is good clinical analytical medicine. If you can't do that in this environment with the kinds of presentation of disease, you can't help patients.
mhm. Well, we're certainly seeing a whole new genre of diseases, you know, post-acute sequelae after the infection, long COVID, vaccine injury syndromes. But, you know, Dr. McMillan, what was most important to me that confirmed that we've entered some new era in medicine wasn't looking back. It's actually looking to what developed right out of the pandemic, and that has been transgender medicine. Now, in the UK, been several years ahead on this, and in Netherlands and some other places. But there's no PrEP Act, there's no emergency use authorization, there's no public health emergency. But suddenly, a new standard of care was born, and that is a young person who has gender dysphoria approaching puberty. The standard of care, according to the boards, American Board of Internal Medicine and the American Board of Family Practice and OB-GYN, the standard of care is to start puberty blockers or even post-puberty hormones and then refer for gender surgeries, mastectomies and orchiectomies and penile inversion vaginoplasties and things like this. It was the suddenness of this transgender, instead of letting the children go through normal puberty and appropriate psychological counseling. It was the suddenness of the transgender change or revolution in medicine. And the same thing, anybody who spoke out against it was spreading misinformation and needed to be censored. To me, that was a huge confirmation that we've entered some new time.
You know, it is interesting because when I talk to patients, part of my humor is to ask whether it's, they're he or she, so to speak, because you don't know who you're talking to. But it's fascinating that I found in all the time of just interacting with patients, I had never come across a single person who understood it. And so I really had to ask, where is it coming from? Because it's not coming from the general public.
Mhm.
It's coming from somewhere else. And
Mhm.
this is what you're saying in terms of what you experienced with COVID. And you're realizing now that, therefore, when there are agendas beyond health and beyond everything else, we just have to fall in line. But it requires, this is the point now, is that in order for us to get through these times, it will require doctors to start becoming patient advocates again.
Mhm.
Can you ever see that happening?
It has to. In fact, I'm disenrolled from all insurance companies. So I see patients privately. I'm overwhelmed with patients. They come from all over the world to see me. We address these issues. They're greatly fearful of not only what happened through the pandemic and the vaccines, but greatly, afraid of what's going to happen to their children with this new transgender agenda. And it doesn't stop there. Agenda 2030 aspires to have 500 vaccines per person, according to the WHO. Many people are now very reticent to take any vaccines. Can you imagine 500 vaccines per person?
Something isn't right. I'm just listening to you and reflecting on it. And you know what the interesting thing is that I remember looking back 2021 going 20, we actually had a small conference about what is plan B if the vaccines don't work. And I used to ask people that question before it came out. I said, yeah, we have wait, but suppose the vaccines don't work, what is plan B? And it was very clear as we started to look at the outcomes and we started to see what was happening with the boosters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, I didn't even talk much about it, but the recent paper came out about 5 days ago. There are no long lived plasma cells in the bone marrow.
Mhm.
And so it's the immune system is treating this in a completely different way.
Right.
And so there needs to now be an acknowledgement from the scientific community that, oops, we have to go back to the drawing board on this. But in the interim, what happens to the patients? Because COVID is still spreading avidly all across the vaccinated world, highly vaccinated regions. What happens to the patients? Any thoughts?
I think if there were no vaccines, this would have been similar to the Spanish flu. I think it would have been over with in 2 years. Remember the original SARS epidemic? It just didn't have the infectivity of the original of SARS-CoV-2, but SARS-1 was about 90 days. I think it would have been over with in 18 months. Uh, my interpretation is vaccination has extended the pandemic now. We will be entering our 5th year of the pandemic. It's been a global catastrophe. People are scrambling. The vaccine injuries, disabilities, and deaths are at record highs. All-cause mortality rising most countries. And the word is out. In the United States, according to the CDC, from January to April of this year, only 1.6% of people took vaccines. Vaccines mandates have been defeated in most places. Now, people are searching for justice. They're searching for capitulation. Will their doctors admit they're wrong? I think we're on a 20-year time frame. It took 20 years from the time Ignaz Semmelweis, mid-19th century, had the data that washing the hands, help reduce infections of endometritis for pelvic exams from pregnant women to pregnant women. 20 years. And then finally the community said, oh yes, Semmelweis was right. From the time Rose and Hill, had conclusive evidence that smoking caused lung cancer. The medical community rejected that. They continued to smoke. They advertised cigarettes. Doctors smoked until the U.S. Surgeon General report in 1960s said, oh, yeah, smoking causes lung cancer. And the same 20-year time frame on the opioid crisis. So I think we're 20 years on this one. It takes about 20 years. A lot of times the doctors have to retire, move on, get old enough. New generation of doctors. We're only 5 years into a 20-year cycle. What's in it for patients is they need to seek the truth, do their own research, understand that the spike protein in their body is the cause of long COVID, and vaccine injury syndromes. We're working as hard as we can to come up with measurements of the spike protein. The approaches, the detoxification approaches, I think centrally should help the body be assisted in clearing spike protein and then doing additional things to help with inflammation and cytokines, etc. And I think finally, Dr. McMillan, we've all been poisoned through the pandemic, whether you've had the infection or the vaccine or both. I think we've all been poisoned to a sense, and we're all on our personal journey now of recovery.
So listen, as we come to the end, Peter, I can see that your journey, your sacrifice, your stance for patients should put you in a position where, in a new world of medicine, you are brought to the forefront to help to lead us into a new way, a new path. If you were given that kind of position, what would you do? How would you go about trying to direct us in a new way?
We need to have a massive, massive educational campaign to catch doctors up on what's happened. Do you know there's been a prohibition of medical grand rounds and continuing medical education on COVID-19, vaccine injury syndromes, long COVID? And doctors in practice now, they simply don't know. When I talk to colleagues, caring for a patient in the hospital with myocarditis, and I tell them I think the vaccine is the cause of myocarditis, they simply draw a blank. They said, I've never heard of this. It's amazing. Doctors in practice never hearing of COVID-19 vaccine-induced myocarditis or thrombosis. Even though we're dealing with this every day in our clinical practice, we've been separated from our colleagues. So we need to have the medical community come around to it. We're going to have tremendous amounts of education. And, like state licensure will probably involve going through a module on COVID-19 vaccination, vaccine injuries, in mitigation strategies, et cetera. We need the vaccines pulled from the market. We need a complete moratorium on gain-of-function research worldwide, because we can't have another one of these hit the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Peter. Tremendous as usual talking to you. And look forward to hopefully speaking with you again in the near future. So just wait with me now while we play the outro. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.